Hi, I'm John Groders. The Global Conference on Sport and Christianity brings together speakers and athletes and fans from all over the world to consider the place that sport can and does and should play in our culture. Co-directors Brian Bolt and Chad Carlson join us on this edition of No Shame.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame of the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid, no shame.
All right, we're downstairs in the studios for the No Shame podcast, and the room is full this morning because I've got two guests, and I'd like to welcome Chad Carlson and Brian Bolt. Thank you guys for getting up early and coming down this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
This is the odd couple. This is the Hatfields and the McCoys working together. This is dogs and cats living together. If you're not from the Midwest, you might not understand, really, this is sort of like a momentous moment to see a Hope College and a Calvin College rep sitting cooperatively at the table, because just to start us out, why don't you guys tell us what the Hope-Calvin rivalry really is? What is the Hope-Calvin rivalry?
Well, I tell you what, it's a big deal to us. It might only be a regional thing. It feels big to us. This is kind of our world, right? So we have these two schools that come from the same roots, and yet we see ourselves through the lenses of our differences. And that comes out most prominently through sports. We've got this great sports rivalry. We're in the same league. We stand for the same things. Both schools have teams that are really good on an NCAA Division III level.
And
we're rivals.
Yeah, it is national in some ways because ESPN recognized it as a top 5 rivalry in the country, which had to be shocking for people that had no idea that Hope and Calvin even existed. And for us, it's really interesting. It probably centers mostly for most of the people that are affiliated with either school in men's basketball. Men's basketball has had a long history of moments where there were controversies, big scores at the end of the game, people rushing onto the floor, different accusations going back and forth, stolen items, all the sorts of stuff that you get in other rivalries. And yet the Hope-Calvin rivalry has gone actually through all the other sports. It's a smaller audience for each of those, but hey, as a golf coach, we look at Hope, and that's the team we want to beat.
How many years have been going on? Hope-Calvin.
Oh, geez. For basketball.
You're the historian.
Yeah, well, the basketball rivalry sort of started, the two teams started playing each other in 1920. Played each other for a few years, and then actually had to take a break from the rivalry because of behavior that was unbecoming of Christians.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, in the 1920s. Took a few years off. And then got back into it once the chaplains of both schools
exactly
believed that this was an okay thing. So, there's a lot of intensity there, a lot of animosity. And so we think ESPN had it right in 2005 when they ranked us as the 4th biggest college basketball rivalry in the country.
Yeah. Well, so it is regional, and if you're listening to us outside the Midwest and you haven't heard of it, that's a little taste of what Hope College and what is now called Calvin University, which seems a little presumptuous to me, I must say.
Agreed.
Calvin University.
I forgot.
Oh,
did you trademark that?
Yeah, we're working on it.
So we're with, this is the intersection of faith and culture has sort of been our overriding theme of the No Shame podcast. And today we're going to really talk about sport and culture and sport and faith. And what Chad and Brian are doing together is something called the Global Congress on Sport and Christianity, which is this year in its 2nd year and is coming up in just a couple of weeks. It's going to have Tim Tebow and people from really all over the world gathering to speak and think and reflect and pray about sport, which is interesting. But before we dive into that, why don't you guys just give me a little bit of your bios in sport. And so we'll start. To my left is Brian. His voice is to my left. That'll help you on your listening to this podcast.
It helps a lot.
Tell us a little bit about your history in sport and culture.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up with a ball in my hand. I loved sports. I think I was that kid that, I was so upset after a rain out or anything like that. I hated missing sports. And I played everything. I grew up in an era when there wasn't year-round seasons. And so I played baseball and whenever I could, and then basketball when the weather got bad, and then football as well. So those 3 were kind of my big sports, but I did everything else too. I'd go out in the backyard and swing a golf club and tennis, all sorts of different things. And so if it involved a ball, I wanted to play. So I continued on through high school. I played those 3 sports in high school. Kind of wanted to continue. Hope College did send me a letter of invite to come and be one of their 10 quarterbacks on their football team. I did not take the offer there, and then
When was that? What years are we talking?
1986 is when I graduated from high school,
Okay.
and then graduated from college in 1990. I went to Calvin, decided to play baseball, played baseball for 4 years, played basketball for a couple years. That was back when you could do 2 sports a little bit easier. A few kids do it now. But also, I just loved being around it so much that I was probably headed to the area of coach and teacher. And so I ended up majoring in a sport area. So it was physical education back then. It's called kinesiology now. After that, I moved on to teach
By the way,
school.
did they change the name of that just so it sounded more academic? Because
Yeah,
majoring
absolutely.
in PE doesn't have a great ring to it, really.
It's all about semantics.
But kinesiology, yeah, your parents
That
can
sounds
dig
real.
into that.
Yeah, and nobody
okay.
knows what it is. It's beautiful.
No,
They
I
think
can't
it's-
even spell it.
It's
But
fantastic.
I can't spell PE if you spot me the first letter.
You're a sharp cookie.
Well,
Your Hope
spell it.
Education's really coming through.
Oh, here we go. It's on now. I wasn't
Oh,
going to tell the audience which side of this, rivalry, but so you,
I think they knew.
You
Anyway.
were, kinesiology, all right.
Yeah, and then I headed on to graduate school and started to just tinker around with coaching. I coached high school basketball for a while. I coached middle school basketball for a while. I started doing different camps and working that way. I went to Calvin actually as a I was a professor, not a coach. I had worked 8 years as a professor in Roanoke, Virginia, but just stayed involved with sports. Started writing about sport and Christianity. When I came to Calvin, that old coaching itch came back, and they said, "Hey, the golf coach job has opened up, and we think you should do it." I said,
Perfect.
I've never coached at the collegiate level. I didn't play collegiate golf, and I've never recruited, never scheduled, never done anything. They said, "You're perfect." So that was it, and I became the golf coach.
Do you get free greens fees if you are the golf coach?
Isn't that shocking? It's kind of nice. I ride around in a golf cart.
Oh, my goodness.
And I
Only reason he
I
does
play
it.
golf.
I
right?
want the job.
Yeah, a lot of people are jealous, and I go on, on spring break and go play places that are amazing.
Build a college for everything.
Absolutely.
It's called research.
That's how. Do we have to talk
No,
about
no,
that?
no.
Okay.
So
All right.
that's Brian Bolt. And the other thing that you didn't mention is that you also share my grandmother's maiden name. So I think we're probably distantly related on the Bolt side of things.
I think that's probably true in West
Probably
Michigan
true.
all the time.
So
yeah.
you can get me free greens fees is what I'm angling on. Chad, what's your athletics history story? Life?
It's not altogether too terribly different from Brian's, but it's been fun for me. So I have 2 kids right now, and as they sort of talk in their classes, and they come home with sheets indicating what they want to do with their lives, and I see them say things like, "I want to be a football player," or "I want to be a basketball player." And I show this to my parents, and they say, "That's funny. You did the exact same thing growing up. I always wanted to be, a professional athlete, and didn't realize until far too late that I wasn't capable of that. But loved playing sports and grew up playing everything like Brian did. It was a different generation. I'm taking a jab here, a more recent generation than when Brian grew up. But it was still one where we could play multiple sports. And so my big 3 were basketball, soccer, and tennis. So I went to college and played basketball. And decided against soccer. That would have been my other choice, but basketball was the one, so played at Hope. And then played a couple years in a very small but ambitious semi-pro league. If you've seen the movie Semi-Pro with Will Ferrell, you kind of get the idea.
The Flint Tropics?
Yeah, we were trading players for a set of towels with other
What
teams,
team
that type
was
of
that?
thing. So there were 2 teams. One was called the Grand Rapids Flight.
Okay.
The other was called the Holland Blast.
Oh, yeah, the Blast. I went to many games.
Blast, yeah. Well,
Sang the national anthem. The Blast, a quick diversion. National anthems have become all the controversial thing lately. But before that, my only problem with national anthems was when they took too long. So I vowed if I was ever asked to sing the national anthem at any sporting event, I would do it in record time. So I was asked to sing at a Blast game, and I've got a little version of it. I mean, it whips right through. And I thought I set the tone so well for that game. The final score is 192 to 174.
Yeah.
So just take
It seems like Hope defense. That's
well,
good.
it
Yeah.
was not that at all. In fact,
12 threes for a couple of
How
guys.
long
it was
were
all
those
about
quarters?
speed. The game was all about speed.
Okay.
So we had 12-minute quarters, but it was a 20-second shot clock. And so you were coming down in one
You might
pass
have
and
been
shot.
playing that game. Were you playing that game?
I was.
194 points?
Yeah. Well, if the fact that you don't remember whether I was playing or not means that I probably was. I was I was pretty
Did he have 40
unmemorable.
that night? Yeah, probably.
I was pretty unmemorable on that team. I'll say that much. But
Well, even low-level basketball, though, it's funny because we kind of mocked the league, but they were fantastic players.
Oh, they were.
They were league MVPs from
Sure.
smaller leagues. So this wasn't like the old man's beer league. I mean, you don't score 194 points. And it wasn't they weren't playing D. They could just hit everything.
Well, that was exactly the problem. You couldn't play any defense because the shots were going up so quickly, right? That was part of the fun of it. There were good players, like you said. It wasn't a great league. It's now defunct, like so many minor league basketball leagues. But anyway, so that was sort of that was kind of my athletic life. I going through college had no idea what I wanted to major in. Didn't know what I wanted to do because they said follow your passion. My passion was sport. I wanted to get into ministry, and then coincidentally enough, my basketball coach, who was a very strong Christian man, talked me out of it and said, no, you actually need to get into coaching with me. So I did that for a few years.
Oh, is that Glenn?
That was Glenn.
Oh,
Yep.
good. Glenn Van Weeren.
Yep, a wonderful man, great mentor. So sort of talked me out of ministry, but talked me into coaching, which is a different type of ministry at a Hope or a Calvin. But then I went out to get my PhD at Penn State and really fell in love with the study of sport. It was sport philosophy, sport history, and to see that we could talk about sport from these intellectual angles was really interesting to me.
What years were you at Hope playing basketball?
Yeah, I was there 1999 to 2003.
Okay.
You are young.
Yeah, no
Well, it doesn't feel like it anymore.
But he has a PhD, so he's qualified.
I guess.
So we're talking about this sort of intersection of things, and I share you guys' passion for sports, and it's been a really wonderful blessing in my life. When I was young, it gave me something to do, and I love it till I was late for our podcast this morning, and my excuse was the NLDS went till 12:30 in the morning.
Good excuse.
And I actually was watching it, and my kids. So I'm already on the same page as you guys. But I remember having these deep conversations in college, and I was going to go out for the Hope basketball team, and I went to tryouts the first day. The worst guy on that team was his league MVP in high school, and I realized I think I'm going to get into broadcasting. I'm shorter, slower, and it's not going to happen for me. But I was involved in the broadcasting of basketball, football through college, and have played all those sports. But that meant I was an intramural guy, so we played intramurals, which was a lot of fun. And we were trying to grow in our faith as well. And I remember coming back to the dorm room thinking, we're so competitive. Is there anything Christian about how we're behaving on the basketball court? And is there anything wrong with the level of the competitive juices that flow in us? I mean, we were talking about this. Brian, you've written about this. Can you answer my question after all these years?
Oh, man, that's an easy one. Yeah. You're going to hate this answer, but in some ways it depends.
Yeah.
I mean, the intensity of sport, the drama of sport is part of its allure. And so that desire to get out there and get after it is kind of how we're made. We love to play, and play gets enhanced a little bit when we develop our skills. And then when we develop our skills, we want to compare. We want to see how it matches up with others. And so sport kind of evolves from this playfulness to this skillfulness to a comparison. And once you get that comparison, obviously you've entered this world of competition. And in competition, we're trying to show the best of ourselves, and we're also trying to beat the other person or the other team, whatever that is. And that's a challenging spot. It's a razor's edge, and in some ways that can bring out excellence, and it can enhance who we are as human beings. But because it's so close to that razor's edge, it can also lead us in another direction. Sometimes people will really feel bad about that, right? They'll get out, they'll feel that intensity, and they'll think, okay, as a Christian, what I have to do is just not do that. I have to not care about winning. And the truth is that retreat space for Christians is just not helpful. In the end, if you don't care about winning, it's no longer sport anymore. I mean, ultimately, when we enter that competition, we're trying to win. It looks bad from the surface because if I'm playing against you, whatever it is, if it's golf and I'm trying to beat you, I'm going to end up with a good day if I play well, and you're going to end up feeling lousy because you lost. It doesn't sound very Christian, but in the end, because sport operates kind of in this sub-universe, in this sub-space, we make a deal at the front end of this and say we're going to push each other. Part of that deal is sport, right, where we try to push each other in that space to try to win. It just doesn't help to be inauthentic and say, I'm not trying to win.
Participation trophies wouldn't really be the driving force for why we jog, get in shape, practice, work hard, focus, calm our mind. All the things we do in sport isn't only about it's nice to be outside and active.
Those things are all real.
Yeah.
They're all true.
Yeah.
But in the end, if you love sport, it's not for any of those things. I mean, truthfully, it's just not. There are some people that love to be in shape. It feels good. They love to be around their friends. It's social. Those are all good things. But you can get those things in other ways. The reason you're doing it in sport is because you love that competition. And I always say about competition, I both proclaim and confess to love sport, because you end up in this space where you can go over the edge or over the line, or check your own heart and say, this has become too much or too obsessive in my life. A passion has led to an obsession.
So this is where the academic discussion can actually translate to something that I hope is actually helpful for those of us that are by nature competitive or athletic. And Chad, what's your take on that? Can sports become too competitive? Does winning really matter? How have you wrestled with those things as a Christian?
It seems to me that the problem that we have is that we make these competitions into more than what they actually are. And it doesn't mean that we have to take them any less seriously. I like Brian and like you, John, love to compete, hate to lose, love to win. That's sort of how so many of us are wired. To me, the problem is when we compete against each other and we step off the field and then we take that result and we allow that to proliferate and to really become more than what it actually is. So if the three of us are golfing together, I'm going to lose. I'm going to be the worst one. I can guarantee that. I've never seen you swing. I've never seen you swing, but I'm sure that you guys are better than me. So if we were to walk off the course after 18 holes and I lost, my tendency, I think, and this is kind of natural to many of us, is to make that more than what it is to make me feel like I'm an inferior person. But what just happened, you guys just beat me in this game that is intrinsically valuable, that is fun, and that's about it. You guys were better than me on that particular day, and potentially at golf more so than that. But we make it into a feeling of inferiority or superiority in who we are as people. And so sometimes we allow that to become more than what it is, and we drag it on beyond the 18th hole. We take it into the 19th hole and beyond, right? And we take those feelings with us, as opposed to just being able to say, I had a great time, I lost, I'm not as good. But we allow it to sort of fester among us. And that's part of where the problem is for me. And so when I think about my engagement in sport, the times when my heart is right, Brian referenced that, when my heart is right is the time when I can leave the field, leave the course, leave the court, whatever, and be able to feel some satisfaction in terms of what went on, that I had a great experience. Yeah, I might feel badly if I lost. I might feel better if I won. I usually do. Not win, but I usually feel better when I win. But when we allow those things to fester, it sort of pulls at us in a negative way.
So you ask yourself, if you're listening to this podcast, is this making sense to you? In fact, it's not only when we play a sport, and maybe if we play the sport that's our best sport, we win. If we play a sport that's our worst sport, we lose. But now it's not even when we play sports. When we watch sports with a bunch of players that we've never met in our life, who are in another income tax bracket times 10, and they lose, we feel the same way sometimes, I think. Does that sense of competition or fantasy football, how come we hate to lose even when it's projected onto our favorite team?
Well, I'm a horrible fan, and because I get far too in it. Right, there's two teams that I love in terms of college football. That's kind of what I love to watch. Right, I love Penn State, and I love whoever's playing Michigan, and I hate that about myself in some ways, that I get such joy out of Michigan playing poorly, not doing well.
You sure heard the Giants fans commenting last night. The Dodgers blew the game, and Giants fans are in heaven in the baseball world. Same as what you're talking about.
That's exactly it, right?
That's just evil. That's just wrong, man.
Well, we call it Schadenfreude, right? When you take joy in someone else's pain.
Schadenfreude,
right? That's a great word to say. It's an ethics word, but I don't think I deal with that well descriptively as a person.
Yeah.
Me watching sports, I get far too caught up in my team, and that's a problem. But I don't want to get rid of that in my life, because I do think there's some benefits to that. I think that it brings some joy to my life. I think it brings some spice.
I think one of the great values in sport is that it is something that we can act as if it's the only thing going on. We actually enjoy throwing ourselves into that moment. We love the idea that this has significance. But the great sort of benefit of sport is that it actually doesn't. It has no significance whatsoever.
Right.
And so that whole idea of play acting, when you are becoming a fan and you are throwing yourself into that fandom, it's more fun when you do that. When you pick a side and have an opportunity to root for a particular team. I mean, I'm a Detroit Lions fan. who would do that, right? Who would put themselves
Last
through?
shall be first, a biblical Christian, as I always say.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. So they're for real this year, by the way. Yeah,
Absolutely.
So one of my favorite things is to try to get myself prepared for what is going to be this year. This year, right? So we're going to get ourselves to this point, and people that aren't sports fans, my wife will just look at me and it's like, why do you put yourself through this, right? Why do you get upset? But shortening, I think Chad said it earlier, like shortening the space between that real disappointment you feel, right? I feel real disappointment. We lost. It was fun because I had the guts to invest, right? I picked a side and we lost, but then that space between that and real life, the more mature we get, the shorter that space is.
It's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. And a Lions fan can quote that. Do you think, I was driving in this morning thinking, this is way off the reservation, but where does this come from? I don't know anything about sort of genetic DNA passing on, but there's got to be some echoes of our historical past that sort of we're born with. There's some instinctual things. Because competition at one time was about, the Olympic events are basically war games, right? It's spear throwing and throwing rocks at each other and running away from the opponent. It's all war games. Well, in that context, sport did have some consequence. Do you think we're still wired from that? Is that just crazy talk?
Playing games are ubiquitous, right? Across geography and across time. Humans have always had this inclination to do things that are not necessary, but that bring joy. Some of that comes from, so the actual activities, the actual behaviors that we do in our sports come from war, they come from survivalism. You throw a spear to try to catch food, to be able to eat, to live, but then we think, spear throwing is fun. Why don't we just do this for distance or, compare ourselves to someone else? We do that with running, we do that with wrestling, we do that with swimming, all these primitive activities that have now turned into sports. And so anthropologists look back on that and they say, there's something fundamental about those behaviors or the ways in which we've used them extrinsically, that is for food, for survival. Now we tend to use them for fun through our sports and our games. But there's also an element of competition that's kind of been bred in us because of all the ways that we had to compete to survive. And so we are now the byproduct of generations and generations ago of people that had to be competitive in some sense to be able to survive.
Yeah, and I think the idea that sport in and of itself is worthy, it's intrinsic is the word that you use, that we just play it particularly for joy, has always been blended with this idea of utility, right? So everybody always says, well, you're taking the fun out of it by having it matter or having it worth something. And the truth is, it's always been blended. But going back to those Olympic Games, people said, all they got was a crown, olive leaf crown. And the truth is, they didn't. They actually were really well-paid athletes. If they won an Olympic crown, they also went back to their city-state and ate for the rest of their life on the city. So there were always professional athletes. There was always exploitation. And so sport is always kind of that derivation. It's a movement away from play. It's something that's humanly created, but what we like to say, it's out of the good stuff God left here. There is some, it's a worthy intellectual exercise to wonder whether competition in itself is evil. When we start thinking about what happens to us in a competitive environment, it's worth asking that question. Now, Chad and I don't end up in a space where we make that final conclusion, but it's worth thinking about that. And it's also true, people ask me all the time about their kids. Should I force them to play sports? We often make too much out of what sport can do. We all say, well, if you don't do this, you'll never learn to be loyal or trust or work with a team. That's not true. There's a bunch of people that learn in lots of different ways, right? Sport is not going to teach you everything you need to know about sport or about the world. And so when I answer that question, I generally say every kid needs to play. That's inherent. But not every kid needs to play competitive sport. Competitive sport kind of leans toward those sorts of people that really like to, go for excellence in a particular area.
Well, that's a great point, and I really agree with you. There's no one size fits all, and you can get people on both sides of that spectrum that can become quite passionate. We can explore how it worked in our own lives and in our own families. But all three of us at this table are naturally attracted to, at least I was as well, competitive team sports, and they were beneficial. But I like this razor's edge that you've been talking about, because if we can grow through this discussion, I would love to be more and more more healthy and more balanced and more Christ-like, even in competition. And when I hit a bad shot on the golf course and say a word that I don't really say, but let's just say hypothetically that I said a word that I don't say.
Somewhere in your head, you may be saying that, yes.
Or other things. You do sometimes sort of see the ugly side of yourself come out in competition. Is there anything we can do to play hard, to do everything that we think is healthy on that edge of that line, and still start to mature a little bit? And have you seen how that can happen?
You know, the interesting thing is that we think that that is different than the rest of life, but truthfully, all of life is very similar to that. And sport doesn't fit its own category in that way, right? So if you go to work, you could also be on a razor's edge. And in your family life, you could also be on a razor's edge in terms of tipping one way or the other way. And really, the beauty of sport is that, well, truthfully, a lot of people have separated it, and they said, well, there is one way to do sport, and we also often try to clean it up. In other words, there is a Christian way to do things, not swear, for instance, right? So one of those things that we might slip in there to say, well, we've now cleaned up sport, and truthfully, I don't think it's there at all. I don't think – so when we talk about where your heart is, those are things that you understand very quickly, right? If you really ask yourself the big questions, have I obsessed too much on this thing? Chad and I have written about envy, for instance, right? In sport, we always want what somebody else wants, but when envy takes over, right? When I want it so badly that it's obsessive, and maybe what I'm trying to do is drag you down in the process, I've moved from something that is potentially a virtue to a really negative vice. And so that's kind of the line between virtue and vice.
See,
where we're
Tanya
watching
Harding, example A.
Exactly. Right? She got to a certain point where she was, truthfully, the better skater, but because of the circumstance and because of the way the world viewed the other skater, she was second fiddle, right? So what she did is she took matters into her own hands. She wasn't going to win the gold medal even by taking her out, right? By hitting her on the leg. She was just making sure that she would feel good in a moment by really attacking her enemy.
So we're getting into the concept of cheating now. And I think what you said earlier, and really sports don't matter. I'm sure both of you have a lot of trophies that you won when you were in the 6th grade of sports. And do you still have them? I still have mine. They're in a box somewhere. Like, why do we not throw those things away? They really don't matter, and nobody cares. But doggone it, I was an all-star when I was 7 years old, and it matters to me. But they don't matter. None of this matters. But then you get this. And it was a big controversy way back in like the 20s, the Chariots of Fire era, between the amateur and the professional. And there was the amateur golf and then the professional golf, and they were at odds. And then the Olympics were a long time, amateur versus professional. And somehow amateur is sport for its own sake. It's for the wreath and the intrinsic benefits, but not the extrinsic ones. And then the professional comes along. Well, now it matters, right? Now it matters because your money is at stake, making a living for your family. So I want to ask you guys about two things. What's the difference to a person between the professional and the amateur as a participant? But then, this is a long question, as a fan, once we start wagering on the sports, right? Once it becomes a gambling proposition, now it matters in a different way. What happens to sport when money gets involved?
Yeah, boy, these are some great questions, and some that, like you said, we've wrestled with for almost a century, really. Well, as people, we've wrestled with it for centuries. But, in the U.S., at least from the advent of modern sport in the late 19th century, we have dealt with this issue. And the funny thing about amateurism versus professionalism is that, so many scholars have looked at this, so many sport administrators have tried to draw a line in the sand between the two, and it's just not very clear cut. So few of us are actually playing organized sport just for the love of the game, right? That's what amateur means. It comes from the Latin root word for love, right? Amos. And so we're taking a look at doing something for the love of the game and then doing something for some other benefit, right, as a professional. And it's so difficult to be able to identify someone as being a true amateur because so often our intentions are mixed. We might show up at the golf course or show up at the court any particular day, for fun, for the enjoyment, but there might be other things that are weighing on our intentionality for why we're doing what we're doing. So it's really hard to determine between those two things, what is a pure amateur and then what is a professional. Because I still want to believe that my favorite NFL player, Saquon Barkley, still plays because he loves it. He has to show up if he's going to receive that huge paycheck every
You
week.
just love him because he went to Penn State?
That's
or is it
exactly
anything
right.
else?
Well,
that's how shallow you are?
Well,
You're an author,
I'm a little bit.
doctor?
I'm a little bit envious of his quads. You know,
Yeah,
he's got
okay,
these,
well,
like,
that's
Okay.
more
He's
legit.
unbelievable.
I don't know that this podcast is about stuff like that.
envious of the way in which he can run.
He's a great athlete.
So he's a great athlete, right? So I think there's something. He's an amateur in some sense, but he's also paid as a professional, right? And there's both of those things going on, and I think that's an important thing to talk about. Now, when we bring gambling into the mix, right, from a fan's perspective, in some ways, at its root, what we're doing is we're adding a game onto the game. We're making it competitive for the fans in a way that the fans can't have if they're just sitting watching the game. They're putting something on the line. We get that from gambling. We get that from fantasy sports, whether there's money involved in your fantasy league or not. You're adding a game onto the other game. It's a derivative game. It's in some ways a parasite of that first game, right? How much do we want to let that parasite fester and grow? But that's what we're doing. We are gaming up our experience of watching sport.
And Chad talked about sort of that mixed amateur and pro thing. And for many of us, maybe it's not monetary, but we go because when we play sports, that girl is watching, or we want to be in that social group. And so there are different sort of byproducts of sport that come through. But when we talk about people that are actually making their living, I think it moves into another category, especially from a Christian perspective. I'm no longer looking at a theology of play and trying to understand sport. I'm really looking for those folks at a theology of work, right? Because they have flipped their activity now to work. But the funny thing about professional athletes is they will do their best to stay out of that space psychologically. So they'll talk about, just playing one game at a time. They don't want to talk about the big picture because they know to play well, and this is more sports psychology than anything else, they know to play well, the more they think about those external benefits, the worse they'll play. And so if you can force your mind, if you can get yourself to the place that I'm playing just for fun, you'll play more loose, you'll play more active, you'll be better. Ultimately, you'll get more of those benefits from sport. But it's a little bit of a shift that those folks have to deal with because we see this all the time. As the pressure grows, my abilities often diminish. And so it's trying to work into a space that I can actually make money at something and yet hold on to why I got started, which is the love of the game.
Man, there's so many fascinating topics. I really love this conversation. I'm talking today on the No Shame podcast with Brian Bolt and Chad Carlson, who are cooperating on the Global Congress on Sport and Christianity. Both of you guys have written interesting books on the subject, and that's what we're talking about today. You both are working at D3 colleges, and you're both coaching at D3 colleges. Now, if it's still the case that I used to remember, you're technically not getting scholarships to play sports at a D3 college. Is that still the truth?
That's still the case.
So,
except for Hope, they probably do it
well,
all the time.
but don't blow our cover right
okay,
now.
yeah,
That's why we win all the time in basketball against you. No,
Whatever.
But so we're talking about the transition between professional and amateur athletics. I've been saying for a long time, nobody has ever been paid in the history of the world to play golf. Nobody has ever been paid in the history of the world to play baseball, to play anything. You don't get paid to play the sport. Nobody will pay you to go play the sport. If you will go outside today and you hit 500 free throws in a row and nobody's watching, it's worth nothing. You only get paid for people to watch you play the sport, or maybe you can coach them in the sport. You're really just in the entertainment industry. And no matter how great you are, you wrote about Christy Mathewson in your book, and I've loved Christy Mathewson. Your book, was it you? Bucknell. He played 3 sports.
Yeah.
I got one of the books wrong. Christy Mathewson's a great pitcher from a long time ago. And if I have it might have been Walter Johnson. I think it was Christy Mathewson, but I remember a story, reading a biography, that he went and did a baseball demonstration at one of the service academies. I think it might have been at Annapolis, but it could have been West Point. And in that day, baseball wasn't he wasn't famous, but he was pinpoint accurate. And he made a bet with one of the guys on the base, and the bet was $20 or something, which was significant. And he had to have a catcher put the glove down and not move the glove for 20 pitches in a row. And the Army bet that he couldn't do it, and he bet that he could. And Christy Mathewson threw 20 pitches in the center. That kind of control is unheard of. Mm-hmm. But nobody paid for that, although that was a gambling bet. But the point that amateur to professional doesn't change the essence of the game. It just changes now people will pay to watch you play it. But when we add scholarships into the mix, colleges are giving scholarships which are worth tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars. And so younger and younger athletes, they are not just playing for the love of the sport anymore. They're playing for the scholarship. And now you've entered a world where if I get 30 shots up a game and you get 15 shots up a game, my scoring average is higher. I mean, what does this do? I'm really asking this big intellectual question. What do scholarships in college athletics do to amateur sports?
Yeah, well, it makes it a job, right? And so the fact that there's a contractual relationship between the school and the athlete changes things. Right now, we don't have that at Hope and Calvin. We can't enter into a contractual relationship. So Brian, as a golf coach, can certainly say to his athletes, look, I need you guys in the off season working on your game, right? And I'm going to provide you with opportunities, but he can't be there to mandate that they're there. And so that gives the students sort of an ability to make their own choices about how good they want to be, how much they want to work at it. But if you're on scholarship, there are demands on your time. There are requirements because of the contract that you've entered into. So, in terms of Christian leadership, we talk a lot, at least in this region, about the Max Dupree idea of covenantal leadership as opposed to contractual leadership, from a business perspective. But I think this fits for sport, too, that when there's a contract involved, there's necessarily a professional relationship in terms of what's going on, and that pulls away from our freedoms to make choices in terms of how we want to step into this and participate in this event. And that seems to be the case for me in terms of scholarships, what that changes. Now, that paints a kind of a jaded picture on scholarships, right? They're not all bad, and certainly they give certain student athletes abilities to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to because of finances, for instance. It gives someone access to a free college education. And from Hope and Calvin, boy, we would long for something like that, for our students to have access to a free or reduced cost of our colleges. And so there's a positive and a negative there. Mm-hmm. I think for young people to be able to enter into college at an affordable rate, but also then you're entering into a job.
Yeah, and I do think that the response that each person has is a little bit different. But as the pressure grows or as the requirement grows, a lot of this stuff that we're seeing now has been pushed down by age, right? So now we're talking about scholarships at age 5, 6, 7. Right. People are getting their kids involved in sports, specializing early. And it is becoming a job early. And Chad and I will see this. I'll certainly see this. Levels of burnout, right? So excellent for me, excellent golfers who come out and try out for the golf team. Finally, they've not realized their dream in terms of being able to get a scholarship. They end up at a place like Calvin College, still excellent at what they do, but they have sort of run out of love for the game because the game had been turned to a job much earlier. I even had one kid once who he's trying out for the team and he's struggling a little bit, and I could just see he was unhappy. And I just said to him, "Hey, who wants you to make this team more, you or your dad?" And he said, "My dad." And I said, "How about I cut you and save face?" He's like, "I'll take it." So, truthfully, it is too bad, right? That they get. But at the Division III level, there is no contract. We can sort of pull those things off in the end. But I do think that the more we bring in those extra aspects, the more we make a big deal out of what sport can offer, the less of the population that we can actually develop in terms of sport. In the end, it's going to be 1 or 2% of kids that play sports on a Saturday afternoon that will end up as scholarship athletes.
1 or 2%. Yeah. That's how rare it is.
And the age has, like you said, Brian, it's gone down. And I see this. So I have a brother-in-law who coaches club soccer at a really, really good club soccer team in California. He's coaching 8- and 9-year-old girls. And so right now their parents are paying a lot of money for them to have the right to be on these teams, right? So we've certainly given this access to only the higher socioeconomic status folks. But the interesting thing is that there is a contractual relationship there too. So this starts at a young age, right? Parents are willing to pay the costs to be on the travel team, for instance, and this happens all across the country. Right. And there's a contract there. What that means is the coach has to play the kid or the coach has to whatever else. It becomes less fun in some ways because of this contract, because of the professional relationship there. So, my brother-in-law who's coaching these young girls who know no differently, right? He's trying to make it fun for them, despite the demands from the parents that they want to see victories, and despite the demands from the club that wants the prestige of the wins. Boy, it's got to be fun at that age. I mean, 8 and 9 years old, how much younger can we get in terms of a professional contractual relationship? So many college athletes now are coming up with the upbringing that they have been a part of a contract throughout their lives already. They're not just entering into the first contract as a scholarship athlete in college. There's been a contractual relationship up through their club teams.
So Andre Agassi, the tennis player, wrote an autobiography called Open. And the first line of the book, I don't know if you've read that book, is I hate tennis. And you talk about that parental push. So Agassi had a Gestapo father.
Yeah,
They gave him no life but tennis. Now you could, evaluate, well, he made a lot of money on tennis and he became world famous and he had a lot of opportunity, but he hated the sport. And so when we're talking about the integration of sport and faith, if you hate the sport you're playing, that's a whole nother discussion than kind of what we've been talking about, which is the desire to compete and enjoy the game. I hate tennis. Andre Agassi.
Yeah, so Andre Agassi, in terms of the amount of success that he had, is actually a rare case. Because if you go through and look at, for instance, Olympic athletes and many others, they will actually have some balance in their life. And sort of the progression is that the love sustained them at various phases. And so we even talk about that sort of lowercase love, where I ask my players, if you don't love to play, love to practice, and love to compete, why are you here? Right? So one of the things that, and the truth is you don't have to love those things, right? So in the end, we want people to be moved by a reason beyond those external benefits. There might be some external benefits, but at the same time, just for every Andre Agassi, there are hundreds and thousands that drop out, that quit, that burn out, that don't make it to the level that he does. I think many of the athletes that have those sort of pushing parents have some of those issues, but sometimes those athletes are also pushing their parents. They're showing the love, which has brought the parents back to it. I think parents are amazingly delusional. It's shocking how they really believe. It usually goes like this. I spent like $500 one year for my son's travel baseball team. He played against a team that was spending $23,000 a year, flying all over the country. And so there is high levels of investment. Kids read that. They know how much money is going into certain things. They figure it out, and they know that there's that contractual obligation. I think for all of those circumstances, parents will think to themselves, once they've spent $23,000, they have to say, my kids love it. My kids love it. And the kids have to pretend to love it. And so as a parent, it's not easy, but you've got to find ways to check those things as you're walking through year by year, season by season.
Andre Agassi was a unique case too, and I think there was something going on subconsciously there, and something, the relationship with his dad that I think was deeper than what any of the three of us are really capable of dealing with. But he loved it, and he hated it. He hated it, right? And he could say that, and he did say that, and it was provocative, right? It's a great opening sentence for an autobiography.
Yeah.
And it was a great book.
Yeah.
But there was something that kept drawing him to it.
That's all I knew.
Right. It was all he knew. It literally was all he knew. And so, that was his life, and he was drawn to this. And there was something, I think, about what he hated that also drove him in some ways. And so there's sometimes sort of this fear or nerves or anxiety that sport allows us to sort of be at our best at times when it's consuming us. Sometimes it's very unhealthy, and he had bouts of that with his dad, the relationship that totally broke down, his injuries. But there's something interesting about the depth of emotions that he felt towards the sport of tennis that I think is worth exploring a little bit more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's normal for us to be attracted toward things where we show aptitude. And so it's just it happens that we often just end up in our own space, right? We're pretty good at this, and therefore we're going to keep coming back. And when you have that success, that's our safe space at that time. And so he stuck with it all the way through. We don't know exactly what all of that is, but it's a cautionary tale for us because for every parent who thinks that their kids love it, Andre Agassi had been moved to the point that it became, I'm excellent at this, but I hate it. And it is in many ways, he was saying, it has altered my life in negative ways.
It is a great book, by the way. If you ever get a chance to read a good autobiography, Open. You've each, speaking of books, written a book. And so I'm going to ask each about your book. So, Brian, your book is called Sport, Faith, Life. What's it about?
Sport, faith, life.
All right,
I got it
next,
covered
Chad.
there. Exactly.
Your book. Okay. No.
Yeah, no, it's a joke, but it's true. So what I tried to do with this book, it actually came out in a series where I was told, and my kids mock it and call it a pamphlet, not a book, because it's about 100 pages. And the point there was to make this conversation accessible. So the idea there is to turn it into a number of stories where people can think about maybe the depth of what sport is, what it isn't, and where does Christianity fit in those. And so we tackle issues like the history of sport with the church, and this had this dubious relationship. We talk a little bit about competition and really ways to try to check your heart as we walk through as families or as people that are involved in love sport.
I think it's great to have this discussion, especially as a fanatic that I am. And I'm reading a book right now called The Mulligan by Wally Armstrong and Ken Blanchard. And it's about golf, and it's about a guy who's super intense in life and business, and he goes on the golf course super intense. And one of the great lines in the book is, aren't we out here to play golf, not to play golf swing? And I like the fact that I'm supposed to play golf. Now, whenever I play golf, there's a wager on the line, and the wager is iced tea. And the winner of the skins will get a free iced tea. That's just enough to just about focus you, but it's still supposed to be play. And I do want to find a way, like you said in Sport, Faith, and Life, to be healthy about this, to not pretend I don't love sport, but to do it in a healthy, God-honoring, honoring my opponent way. I think it's possible.
Yeah, and that $1.50 for that
right.
iced tea really matters to you, I'm sure,
it's
right?
The sweetest iced tea that's unsweetened, but it's sweet. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I guess what I would say to you first is it's okay to love sport. It's okay to go out and love the competition, to want to do well. It's okay to, walk off the golf course disappointed, because if you do not risk enough to care, then it's not sport anymore. And so it's just important for you to go ahead and allow yourself to do that. And then, as Chad talked about, as you step away, as you walk away, is it living in its correct space?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're listening to this and you are a sports fan, take that to heart, man. We can do this, and it is okay to love sports. And let's find a way to put our heart in line. Chad, your book, Making March Madness, 1922 to 1951. What's it about?
Yeah, so this is a book about the origins, the early years of the NCAA college basketball tournament, along with the NIT and some other competing tournaments early on. So this is a history. It's a history for people who love basketball. I got a chance to meet Clark Kellogg a couple of days ago, and gave him the book and said, "This is for this is for you, right? You're a person that would really appreciate this." So it's a history.
At Ohio State?
Yes,
He did. Okay.
he did. Played at Ohio State. Played in the NBA. College basketball analyst now. So the book is about how the NCAA tournament came from this really small mom-and-pop operation back in 1939 when it started, and actually lost money to now the colossus that it is, right? This $1 billion a year entity. And it had some growing pains, but it also had some really shrewd administrators that kind of took over and set it on a path to prosperity, which it is now.
And you deal even a little bit with James Naismith and the origin of the game and 11 players on his side and some of the fun stuff like that, right? Because this is of all the sports, this is recent, invented, specific. It didn't sort of evolve over time in some ways like track and field.
That's absolutely right. Basketball has a birth story that's much, much more well-known than any other sport, right? And to sort of see how it grew, really, so if we look at the life of the game of basketball, my book details what I call the adolescent through college years of the growth of the game of basketball, right? So it was in its infancy with James Naismith, 1891. And there's no dribbling at first. It's all about health benefits. Naismith, by the way, cared so little about competition that he was the only coach in Kansas University history to have a losing record. He would go on the road with his teams, and he would referee the game, and his teams would lose. That's how little he cared about winning. So he created this game for health.
It was all for health.
All for health. And it's to develop young men and their Christian character.
Well, if there's one thing I can say about the modern NCAA tournament, it's that it's all for health.
Absolutely.
That's all it is.
That's your
anymore.
takeaway right
That's
there.
my
That's
That's why we
takeaway.
love March Madness.
So we love March Madness, and it is exciting, and I'm glued. And I was at a massive sports bookie in Vegas last year for that final Virginia game. So I'm a complete, and I'm filling out the pools. But I got to be honest, I hate it at the same time. And here's what I hate. I hate that we go into that there's only one winner and there's 63 losers in sports. I really hate that, even though I'm also addicted to it. You guys, Hope and Calvin, I mean, if you win the conference, and back when I was at Hope, and maybe even when you guys were, there was only like 6 teams or 7. There's a couple
8
more
now.
now. There's 8 now. But doggone it, you are a champion if in your senior year you win your conference. When I loved the bowl games growing up, if you won your conference, you were a champion, you got a ring, and then you played in the bowl game against the champion of another conference. And after that, we can all argue about whether the winner of the Orange Bowl could have beat the winner of the Rose Bowl, if the winner of the Cotton Bowl could have beat who cares? And in 1997, Michigan's a national champion, Nebraska's a national champion. Who cares? But now, March Madness, everybody walks off the court a loser except one team. Is that beautiful or is that sick?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both. And I think that's part of the allure of March Madness is that it's these one-off games, right? So we have it's not a series, right? So we're watching right now, the divisional championship series for Major League Baseball, right? Yeah. There's a series of games. If you lose one, it doesn't mean you're out. But there's so much more on the line when it's that one-off game. And really, Major League Baseball is taking that on with the wild card now. But it's so intense, right? When it's win or die, really, in the tournament. I mean, that's the only way you keep going. So there's really, there are a lot of losers. But I think there's a way in which, a lot of coaches and a lot of teams' stock will rise by winning a couple of games, by doing better than you thought. Mm-hmm. Such is the nature of the uncertainty of sport. That's what lures us in, right? And so when there's a one-off game, it's unlike the NBA playoffs where it's best of 5, best of 7. It's one game, and anyone can win one game. That's the fun of it.
But I would also say that what you're longing for still exists. And so there are still Big Ten champions. There are, at my level, when we win a conference championship, and our athletic director will say this to us all the time, no one can take that trophy away. Right? So there is that small moment, that small victory. As you continue on in sports, you realize that there's always only one team, right? There's only one team that ends the season on a high note in just about every circumstance, right? So you have a high note, and then you go on and you compare yourself at another level, at a greater level. And so those things still exist. That's why winning championships last longer than some of these different moments. Like, hey, we made it into the NCAA tournament, but we didn't win our championship. That's not as exciting. I mean, those things sort of fade away, whereas a trophy always lasts, and that's why we keep them, right? In sport, trophies matter. We want that green jacket. We want that claret jug. We want those things, and in sport, they matter. And to pretend that they don't is actually inauthentic. So I think that those things still exist, and because of that, I think we can do both, right? And acknowledging, I think it's really important. Every year in sport, there is a new champion, and then there's another year. Scott Kretschmar, a sport philosopher, talks about the next time, right? So sport has this rebirth. He even calls it redemption. This opportunity that we didn't make it this time, we have next year. We're back to the Detroit Lions. We didn't make it this year. And so the redemption of sport is really shake hands, I'll get you next time.
Let me ask you guys to close with this. The Apostle Paul references sport. He references the Olympics. He is speaking to a Greek audience, and the Olympics were a big deal, and they knew all about athletics. And he says in a spiritual way that we should run the race of our lives in order to win the prize. How does that connect kind of the conversation we've had today? And I'll let you go first, Chad, and I'll give you the last word, Brian.
The Apostle Paul knew, because of his time in Corinth and with the Greek world, how intensely we can get sucked into sport. And so he saw the fervor, he saw the intensity with which people would run the race or fight the fight, and I think wanted to harness that among early Christians. And there's really something cool about that. Not that Paul was a sports fan. In fact, he probably wasn't. But he did see something really valuable within sport about how we approach it, how we step into it with our whole heart, and thought that would be a good analogy then to describe what the Christian faith should be like.
And Brian, you mentioned the prize, that trophy that matters. Now we're talking about a prize that really matters. Paul says, run the race to win. And what does that mean spiritually?
Yeah, and I think as Chad talked about, just the whole body aspect of it, right? So it takes our mind, our heart, our soul, our strength, right, to be able to respond to the gift of grace that Christ has given us. And in some ways, if you take that out of context, it sounds as if we have something to earn. And really, the victory's already been won. And there's a great affirmation there that because that victory's been won, we are drawn by gratitude to run that race and finish well, right? And so that competitive aspect, if you take that to its nth degree, we're not really trying to win, right? We're trying to sell out to everything that Christ has offered us. And so in that, we have the confidence. I think that the ultimate victory is really reassuring. And because of that, we have this opportunity to participate in sport.
Give it everything you've got. If you're in competition and you give it everything you've got, it can take every cell of your body to the last moment of its endurance, and it can take every piece of your mind to quiet your mind and concentrate. And I think Paul is saying to us exactly that. Give it everything you've got, and the victory is already won. Thank you for this conversation. Brian Arbolt, author of Sport, Faith, Life. Chad Carlson, author of Making March Madness. And the Global Congress on Sport and Christianity, it's going to be coming up for the second year this year. It's being held right here in West Michigan, and Tim Tebow and others are going to be there. Thank you guys for this conversation. Really, really fun for me.
Thank you. It's been a blast.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thanks.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame on the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid.
No Shame is a weekly podcast where John Groders discusses life at the intersection of faith and culture with all kinds of interesting and inspiring guests. Subscribe to the podcast today by going to johngroders.com, select the podcast tab, and hit subscribe. Listen whenever you have time, but don't miss any of these life-giving conversations.